Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Dr. Mary Stromberger, Dean of the Graduate School and Vice Provost for Graduate Affairs at Colorado State University. Today, as we celebrate the research, creativity, and entrepreneurship of CSU graduate students at the Grad Show, we also celebrate CSU's 150-year anniversary. I am pleased to welcome our keynote speaker as part of the university's sesquicentennial colloquium series. Communication skills are foundational to your success as graduate students as you move on to any career path. When you, as researchers and scholars, are able to communicate effectively with peers and broader audiences, you are able to connect, engage, and make your work relevant to society as a whole. In doing so, you build trust and are able to influence policy and decision-making at all levels, from communities to large government bodies. Simply put, to be a successful scientist or scholar, you must be an effective communicator. And it's not just about communicating to society, but communicating well across interdisciplinary environments. Communicating across disciplinary boundaries fosters the innovation we know is needed to solve complex issues that we face both nationally and globally. Interdisciplinary collaboration has been an enduring foundation in our 150-year history, and interdisciplinary communication will lead to the transformative solutions in our future. Recently, I learned more about the origins of the honors program at CSU, a program that was created in 1957 when a group led by professors Willard Eddy and Bruce Fry created an interdisciplinary seminar on Leo Tolstoy and invited 15 of the university's best and brightest students to enroll. According to members of the original cohort, the late Professor Eddy felt it was important for scientists to be exposed to the humanities and have an opportunity to discuss philosophical questions posed by writers and thinkers outside their areas of research. It's with the same desire that we are gathered for the Grad Show, to learn about the research, creativity, and entrepreneurship from across the campus, and to enhance our communication skills through experts such as today's keynote speaker. Following the keynote, we're going to have a 30-minute fireside chat that will be hosted by the Graduate Student Council on this stage. I encourage you to write down, if you have any questions for our keynote speaker, write them down on the index cards, and then you can pass them to the front of the room at the conclusion of the talk. And then we'll sort through those cards and get as many questions as we can to our keynote speaker during the fireside chat. As a friendly reminder, too, CSU Writes and the Graduate Student Council will host an expert panel at 3:30 p.m. Entitled Talking Up Your Research to Build Your Professional Network in room 382 of the Laurie Student Center. Please also come and celebrate the conclusion of the day during the awards ceremony in the Laurie Student Center Grand Ballroom at 4:30 and use your free drink ticket. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Melissa Marshall is on a mission to transform how scientists, scholars, and engineers present their work. When scientists can't communicate their ideas with clarity and confidence, innovation stagnates, and powerful solutions to our pressing problems aren't implemented. Melissa Marshall works with researchers and technical professionals across the spectrum, from the halls of academia to the boardrooms of Fortune 100 corporations, to help them transform their presentation skills and present their work in ways that inspire people to take action. Marshall got her start in the scientific communications field as a faculty member at Penn State University, where she developed and researched many of the strategies she teaches today. She's internationally known for her TED Talk Nerdy to Me, which has garnered over 2 million views. This year, Microsoft has recognized her decade of work in transforming the way scientists and engineers use PowerPoint to communicate by awarding her the Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, or MVP, title. Please welcome to the stage Melissa Marshall, founder, Present Your Science.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary, so much. Thanks for having me. Italian poet Dante wrote that from a small spark comes a great flame. Now, we think a lot in research about the great flames, right? What are the great flames of research? Well, maybe it's that awesome funding, right, that you just got. Maybe it's a great collaboration that just occurred. Maybe it's the opportunity to have a real impact on policy in the communities that you're a part of because your research was implemented. Those are the things that we often think about when we think about the great flames of research. But here's what I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in what comes before that. Because, as Dante said, from a small spark comes that great flame. And for me, when I think about what that spark might be, I think it's communication. Right? And specifically, what I talk a lot about is that opportunity when you are standing in front of others, whether it's in the symposium hall that I had the opportunity to spend some time in today, whether it's in front of a conference audience, a classroom, a town forum, your opportunity to communicate and share about your work is impactful and it matters. And here's what I'm concerned about, is that instead of having often those sparks that become the great flames that we're excited about, here's what happens instead. Right? We don't have people that are the key stakeholders engage in our work the way that we want. And here's the thing, when people don't engage in our research, the costs are high. Right? We have powerful projects that aren't funded. We have important ideas that don't get the right interdisciplinary collaboration. We have things that would solve the problems of our communities but aren't supported by our policymakers. And so when we think about why it's so critical, and you'll hear me talk a lot about this today, and I am looking forward to the fireside chat, but you're going to find out that I'm a little bit amped up, all right, on this stuff. And it's because I truly believe that this is the critical piece, that if you are able to master the ability to convey your ideas in a way that people understand and encourages them to take action, that this changes the game when it comes to the impact that you can have as a researcher for your career. And so when we think about what does it look like when an idea is sadly dying, as that quote from Dr. Norton said, what does it look like when an idea is not moving forward? Well, maybe it looks like an audience member like this. Right? And so when we think about these opportunities and then we think about what happens to some of these opportunities when the work doesn't have the impact that you want, this is the picture that I see nearly every place that I go. I love having the opportunity to have these types of conversations with individuals just like yourselves. But here's what I hear. I hear a lot of stories of people where their work falls in the gap. And here's what you can envision. Picture yourself and the research that you're responsible for on the left side of that bridge. And on the right side of that bridge, that's the stakeholders. I already named a bunch of them, but it's the people that can take your work and allow it to move forward to have the impact that you want it to have. And what I'm really concerned about are all of the really good ideas that fall in that gap. And so everything that we talk about today, all right, when I give these types of presentations, I have these types of conversations, what you're going to find is that I'm a very concrete person. So my goal today is not to get you excited about communicating your work. I mean, I hope that will happen. But more importantly, when you walk out of here from this interaction, I hope that you have practical, tangible tools that you can use immediately to help to narrow this gap. That's really what I'm about and what I'll focus on in our time today. Now, here's the first thing that I'd like us to discuss, and I'm actually going to ask a few people to raise their hand. I'll be able to hear you. The space is not that large. I'll repeat it back for those that are joining us on the live stream. Here's my question for you. I'd love to get a few responses. When you think about the best presenter of research, and you can think about research broadly, it could be science, engineering, the arts, but the best presenter that you've seen could be someone you've seen in person, could also be someone you've seen on television or online. But when you think about the best presenter that you've seen, I'd love to have a few people raise their hand and maybe share a name, but here's what I'm most looking for. What quality do they have? Because if my whole goal in this conversation is to help you to become a more effective presenter of your work, I think we have to know first, what's the target? I mean, what does it look like to be an effective presenter? I find that people have a pretty good idea of what they like. So who could start us off? Again, if you raise your hand, I'd love to have a name and then maybe a corresponding quality, because I'd like to figure out in this room, what do we value when it comes to our presenters? Thanks for starting us off. Oh, I love Jane Goodall. That's such a great one. Oh, fantastic. So she said Jane Goodall, and what she loves about her is that she was a really genuine communicator. I think that's a wonderful example. She's someone I admire greatly for her communication abilities. Excellent. Who's got another one? Thanks. I'm sorry? Yep. Ah, excellent. So he said Pat Cole, an empathetic speaker, so really identified with the audience. And I imagine when I think about an empathetic speaker, they create a connection with their audience and help the audience to connect back to the work. Excellent. Thank you. Who else? Another name. Thank you.
Bill Nye, the science guy.
I love Bill Nye. That's a great. What do you like about him?
He gives really good examples and he was enthusiastic.
Yeah, so Bill Nye the Science Guy gives great, exciting examples, has tremendous enthusiasm. That's an awesome one. There was one more hand. Thank you. All right, Carl Sagan, a passionate presenter that really makes the information interesting to the audience. Yeah, that's such a great list, all right, in a short period of time. Here's what I love about asking this question. It does not matter where in the world I happen to be, what type of audience I happen to be talking to in terms of what industry they're in, the same themes always come up. And I think that's really useful for us as a starting point in this conversation, because what that tells us is that we have a shared sense of what it means to present our ideas well. And so I'm going to give you some people that I think about, and if you're not familiar with these, you might jot them down. You can find presentations, videos of them presenting online very easily, and I think these are all great examples as well. The first is that the best presenters have a great story to tell. All right, I mean, when I think about Jane Goodall, wow, she has unbelievable stories that she shares about her work. Carl Sagan was another one, unbelievable stories about the information that he shared. Someone pictured here that I admire greatly is Dr. Jill Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a brain scientist, and what's remarkable about her story is that she's a brain scientist who experienced her own stroke. And what she talks about is how for a period of time, while her stroke was occurring, she was actually conscious. Now, of course, she ultimately lost consciousness. She had a very difficult, years-long recovery. But what she discusses from a famous presentation about her research from the TED stage is she talks about how what she learned from the inside out about how the human brain functions during a stroke actually changed the course of her research when she recovered and went back to her work. So she's a remarkable example. Secondly, and this quality came through very clearly in almost all of the examples, this is a strong one in the room today, the best presenters have passion. Right? They have a genuine enthusiasm for what it is that they're sharing. Here's someone that I absolutely love. So this is Dr. Hans Rosling. He's in my rock star presenter category. Sadly, he passed away prematurely just a few years ago, but while he was alive, he was like a rock star. And what I mean by that is that when he would visit, universities and institutions to give lectures and things like that, it was like a rock star was in town. People would line up hours ahead of time outside the lecture room. It would be standing room only. People would clamor to get the best seats. And here's the thing. Dr. Rosling was a statistician. That's what he presented, statistics. Now, save for the few statisticians in the room, perhaps, when was the last time you saw a flyer for a statistics presentation, you were like, oh man, I gotta get there early, right? I wanna make sure I get the best seat, right? That's not something that happens all that often. I think it's a testament to the remarkable qualities that he had as a presenter, but he's one I think you've gotta see to believe. So I'm gonna show you now just a short clip, a little bit less than 2 minutes. I'm gonna drop you right into the middle of his presentation, all right? And I'd like you to pay attention to what role does his passion play in helping you to engage right away, even with almost no context whatsoever. Dr. Rosling, enjoy.
So this is where I realized that there was really a need to communicate, because the data of what's happening in the world and the child health of every country is very well aware. So we did this software which displays it like this. Every bubble here is a country. This country over here is, this is China. This is India. The size of the bubble is the population. And on this axis here, I put fertility rate. Because my students, what they said when they looked upon the world, and I asked them, what do you really think about the world? Huh? Well, I first discovered that the textbook was Tintin mainly. And they said the world is still we and them. And we is Western world, and them is third world. And what do you mean with Western world? I said, well, that's long life in small family, and third world is short life in large family. So this is what I could display here. I put fertility rate here, number of children per woman, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to about 8 children per woman. We have very good data since 1962, 1960 about, on the size of families in all countries. The error margin is narrow. Here I put life expectancy at birth, from 30 years in some countries up to about 70 years. And 1962, there was really a group of countries here that was industrialized countries, and they had small families and long lives. And these were the developing countries. They had large families and they had relatively short lives. Now, what has happened since 1962? We want to see the change. Are the students right? It's still 2 types of countries? Or have these developing countries got smaller families and they live here? Or have they got longer lives and live up there? Let's see. We start the world. And this is all UN statistic that has been available. Here we go. Can you see there? It's China. They're moving against better health. They're improving there. All the green Latin American countries, they are moving towards smaller families. The yellow ones here are the Arabic countries, and they get larger families, but longer lives, but not larger families. The Africans are the green down here. They still remain here. This is India. Indonesia is moving on pretty fast. And in the 80s here, you have Bangladesh still among the African countries there. But now Bangladesh, it's a miracle that happens in the 80s. The imams start to promote family planning, and they move up into that corner. And in 90s, we have the terrible HIV epidemic that takes down the life expectancy of the African countries, and all the rest of the world moves up into the corner where we have long lives and small family, and we have a completely new world.
So what does he remind you of? Sportscaster, right? Yeah, he's like somebody calling a soccer match or a horse race. And here's what I love about this one. Short clip, no context, dropped right into the middle, and I'll bet you found it's pretty easy to engage. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. First, I think it's worth mentioning he has a really dynamic illustration that goes along with the story that he's telling. Secondly, though, and the one that I want to focus on here, is that he has a tremendous enthusiasm for what it is that he's sharing. I do think it's worth mentioning, though, that I don't show this example because I'm recommending that all the graduate students at CSU now present in this style. That's going to be weird, right? Because here's the thing. I know he does a lot, right? Voice and body, he's jumping around, and it works for him because it's natural and authentic for him. And that's the teaching point, all right, from having from exuding passion and enthusiasm in your talks, is that it has to be natural for you. It's not something that you can manufacture a certain style, like everybody should do this. There's no cookie cutter way to do this. This is a human connection, which means it has to be something that is natural and authentic. And then finally, the best presenters really understand audience. I love that idea of empathy that was mentioned when I asked for some responses from you. The best presenters really understand audience. Someone I think is a great example of this, pictured here, Dr. Elizabeth Wayne. She is a biomedical engineer with an expertise in nanotechnology. And what I think is remarkable about her is that she presents to lots of different types of audiences. I mean, she will present to technical peers at conferences. She also does a lot of outreach for K through 12 students. So she'll present to elementary or high school students. And then she does a lot of policy presentations for funding and those types of things. And what everybody reports is, wow, I got so much out of that. And I think it's because she's a master at understanding audience. So this is our goal, right? This is what we're trying to achieve. And this is something that universally we generally agree on. We all want to be presenters that have a great story of the research. We share that story with enthusiasm, and we do it in a way that makes sense for our audience. And so what I'd like to do with our time together in this first part of the conversation, and then again, I hope that as you're listening to some of these ideas, if you have questions, make sure you're jotting those down, because following the talk, we'll be kind of moving into that fireside chat scenarios. There's a lot of chance for us to talk more deeply about these ideas. But here's what I'd like to share in this first part of the conversation. 3 concrete skills. And I'm going to give you a tool and a strategy for each one that I believe if you were able to start to exude First of all, being a presenter that is audience-centered. Secondly, a presenter that can look at all of your available research and filter and focus on just the most important parts for a particular scenario. And then finally, being a presenter that can illustrate or show your ideas to the audience. If you are able to move towards these 3 skills, I believe that you will really set the path in the right direction for that those critical abilities of communicating your work well and achieving all those things that we just talked about as our target when it comes to communicating our work. And so the first one, and I begin here for a reason because I think all of it hinges on this, that in order to be a successful communicator of your research, you have to first identify your default setting. And here's the default setting for nearly all of us. Our default setting is that we are speaker-centered speakers. And what I mean by that is that we make lots and lots of choices in presentations because it's what works for us, right? So let's think about examples of speaker-centered behaviors. I mean, I can think of lots of them. One of the first ones that I see all the time is people will put their speaking notes on their slides, right? So they'll put lots and lots of text on their slide because it helps them to remember what to say. Also, we like to speak in our own native language, and what I mean by that is our native technical language. We all have jargon, acronyms, things that we're used to talking about with our colleagues all the time, and then when we come to a communication scenario, we still speak in that same language even if the people don't have that same background. That's what I mean about examples of speaker-centered behaviors. And here's the shift. If you could become an audience-centered speaker, what that would mean is that at every stage in the presentation, you would ask yourself, what makes sense for my audience? And you would prioritize the needs of the audience over your own needs. Now, here's what causes this to be challenging, is that often we have audiences that are really diverse. And we could talk about diversity in lots of different ways, but let's just talk about diversity in terms of background as it relates to the research. Rarely do we have the luxury of talking to a homogeneous audience where everybody knows the same things that we know, all right? That's a luxury and not one that we have all that often. What we normally have are we have audiences where they come to a presentation or a communication scenario and you've got people from all different areas. So you have some people in the room that are fellow experts, right? And then you have some people in the room that maybe know very little. And I'll bet those of you that were presenting, and I think quite a few of you were, those of you that had posters down the, upstairs and down the hall today, you were talking to lots of different audience members. I'll bet you had fellow people in your field that came by. I'll bet you had people that had never even heard any of the words before, right, on your posters. So this is a common scenario. And what I'd like to teach you here, if you are trying to be audience-centered with a diverse audience, I'd like to teach you a tool to be more successful. Because here's what often happens, right? What often happens is that we feel like, well, we just have to make a choice. All right, meaning we have to talk to either the experts or we have to talk to the non-experts. And here's what this usually looks like. Most presenters do a good job, right, at the beginning, and I call this a point of common ground, something that everybody in the room can understand. Most presenters do a pretty good job early on of establishing a point of common ground. We know to have something that talks about motivation or importance or context, but then here's what happens. Then they take the dive. Right? And that's the dive into the technical depth, all right? That's the dive into the expert level stuff. Here's the problem. Most presenters take that dive and they never come back. All right, that's the place where people are really kind of comfortable and happy. You can actually think of it this way. As an expert, all right, you're wearing scuba gear. All right, the other people who are also experts in the audience, they're also wearing scuba gear. So you all can take that dive and it's awesome down there. Right? There's cool stuff to see. Here's the problem. In a diverse audience, when you go scuba diving, you are taking people with you that do not have scuba gear. That's the rest of us. And that's really not all that fun. Right? It's not that much fun to go on a long journey under the sea when we're not wearing any scuba gear. And in fact, you can look at this the next time you're in an audience for a research presentation, look around and see if you can identify the people that are actively drowning, the ones that haven't been given scuba gear. All right, you'll be able to do it. In fact, I'm sure many of you have had that same experience. So here's what I'd like you to be aware of. I'd like you to be aware of our natural tendency when presenting our research to be scuba divers. And here's a more successful approach. Be a snorkeler. All right, so be a snorkeler of your work, not a scuba diver. So what does a snorkeler do? Hey, it's totally okay to take a brief dive And you have to in order to convince the other experts in the room, right? You can't spend the whole time at the surface, right? You've got to take some dives. But here's the trick or the nuance. Be aware that the other people in the room can only hold their breath for so long. So you have to bring us back up for air so that you're keeping everybody alive and oxygenated in the room. So the tendency to be a scuba diver means we spend lots and lots of time for a long time looking at all the technical depth. What I'm suggesting instead is it's a brief dive into a key finding, key piece of data, key thing that is expert in nature, and then you come back up for air. So what does that look like? When you come back up for air, all right, when you're adopting this snorkeling approach, what it means is that whatever you looked at down below, you answer the question, so what? All right, so I had this finding, here's a key piece of data, here's a key technical specification. So what? You answer that question. And here's how that can sound. Lots of different ways, all right? But here's a couple of phrases that set off points of common ground that give you that more of that snorkeling approach, which is the reason this is important is because as a result of this finding, the next question this caused us to ask is, those are all examples of points of common ground that help to bring you back up and to give everybody that nice breath, all right, of fresh air to keep everybody with you and alive in the presentation. Here's why this tool is so powerful, and it's one you should get in the habit of doing throughout any communication that you have. Identify for yourself, when am I taking the dive, and make sure that you are punctuating each dive with an opportunity to return to that point of common ground. Here's why I like this tool so much and why I've seen it be so helpful for presenters. This is a practical, actionable way to move you to a place that audiences want desperately from presenters of research. And that is, what audiences are really looking for is they are looking for interpreters of the work, not reporters of the work. And I think that's a disconnect that's happening a lot in communication, is that we have really smart people just like you, all right, who did cool stuff over here. They come to a communication scenario, and they list, give, or report on what they did. Now, here's the difference. In a communication scenario, like a presentation or a poster, it's always by nature a constrained situation. You don't have enough time to list, give, or report on everything. And here's what audiences really want. They don't want you to just come and dump all the information out on the table for them and say, ta-da! Right? That's not what they want. What they want is an interpreter of that information. You did this over here. Tell me why that matters to me. And that's why I think this tool is so important, is that it's an actionable way to move you to that interpreter space, which I believe is rare. Right? Not a lot of presenters achieve this, and it is highly valued. If you become someone that is an interpreter of the findings, an interpreter of the work, that is something that you will see a big difference in terms of how your audience reacts. So that's action item number one. Now, once we've started to think about how to adapt to different types of audiences, action item number two is how do we think about what to focus on? Because, wow, when you look at your field, right, when you look at the amount of information available for you to talk about, I'll bet it looks a lot like that picture on the left. Think of every fish as representing a detail, all right, a technical detail of your research. And now, let's just say your paper has been accepted to a conference. So now you've got a 20-minute conference presentation, right? So you say, all right, I've got all of this work. Now you've got 20 minutes. And here's the question that most speakers ask themselves first. How much can I fit in? Right? So it's the equivalent of, hey, I've got all these available fish. How many can I possibly pack in? How many details can I fit into that 20 minutes? And as soon as you ask yourself that question, you're already heading to a place that's very difficult to be successful from. Here's the difference. Here's what the really good presenters do. The really good presenters are excellent at that part in the middle, and that's the filter. The really good presenters look at all of those available details, and they ask themselves, which ones are most important for this audience, this purpose, and this occasion? But here's why we struggle with that, because everybody likes this concept, meaning that even when I say it right now, like people nod their heads like, yeah, I want to be the kind of presenter that only talks about the ideas that are most important for my audience, purpose, and occasion. Like nobody argues with this. But yet, if I were to set you loose right now, I'd be like, okay, organize a presentation. You know what would happen? Fish, 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 fish. The details creep their way back in, and it's because, as presenters, we are so close to this work that we've really lost a lot of objectivity. All of these seem awesome and important, right? It's like, well, if I talk about this fish, then I want to say a little bit about this. And once I say something about this, like this was kind of cool, and someone might have a question about this, right? So all of a sudden you start creeping all of those details back in. I'll bet those of you that designed posters today, this was probably an enormous eternal struggle on the way to creating your poster, right? It was like, okay, I've only got this much space, but this is important and this is important, and trying to decide, right, how much to put in. I'll bet a lot of you found that to be challenging. And so here's what I think would be helpful. I'd like to teach you a tool to get a greater sense of objectivity, which is the ability to step back from being inside of all of those details and to really think about which ones are most important for what you're trying to achieve in that particular scenario. And so in order to teach you this tool or this strategy to filter details or achieve a greater sense of objectivity, I'm going to walk us through an example first. Now, an image that I have in my mind a lot when I'm thinking about organizing a presentation is that I think it's a lot like leading an audience up the mountain. Right? At the end, every presenter, I believe, should have a view of what they're trying to achieve in their presentation, a view that they want their audience to share with them about the work. So let's say that I'm giving a presentation. All right, the view that I'd like you to walk out of this room with is that I'd like you to believe or understand that new methods are needed to detect pancreatic cancer. All right, so if that's what I want you to walk out of the room with, the question becomes, what would you need to know in order to get there? Right? What are the most crucial details that you would need to understand in order to arrive at this place? And I want you to think about that for a moment. If I want you to believe this, I can't just arrive and say, good afternoon, everybody. New methods are needed to detect pancreatic cancer. Thank you very much for your time. Please forward all of your funding to my lab. I mean, that'd be nice, right? That'd be quite the luxury, but that's not how it works in the real world. We have to do the hard work of tracing the logic trail. So who's got one? What's something you'd need to know? If I wanted you to end up here, what would I have to cover for you? Who's got one that they can say for me? What would you need to know? What's one?
How the current methods are failing.
Exactly. No one's interested in how the current methods are failing. No one's interested in funding new methods if the old ones work fine. Exactly. What's something else that you'd need to know? Yeah. Oh my gosh, you guys could be like plants they're not plants in the audience, but they're playing along just like they are. Yes, exactly. All right, well done, MVP status there. All right, absolutely. They even agreed with the animation, which really makes my life easy. So yeah, I don't even have to like figure out some verbal mumbo jumbo to make this all make sense. It totally works. And so yes, exactly. All right, so what we just did in that very quick example is that we just identified the big fish. Also put another way, the non-negotiable details. Logically, you cannot arrive at this place without covering these two things. Now, I'm not saying these are the only details that would be discussed, but here's what they are. They are the most important ones. And that's critical, because I think what is often lacking in so many of our presentations of our research is a sense of priority. Right? There's a lot of information that you could talk about, but in a certain scenario, you have to prioritize. Right? So these are the high priority items. And once I start to figure out these, now I'm to a place where I could start to organize the presentation, right? Which one would I talk about first? Well, I'd begin, hey, we've got a problem, and you could imagine elaborating on that particular issue. Then I'd move on, here's the analysis of the drawbacks of the current methods. And now I'm in a place where I can now earn or arrive for my audience at the view that I wanted them to have. So that's the thought experiment or the thought exercise. Here's the tool. Here's the actionable item for you. And here's what I'm after. I am after changing the first 10 minutes of preparation that you go through for every presentation. And it might even be a little less than 10 minutes, but 10 minutes or less. Right? I'm after a workflow shift, 10 minutes or less. So I want you to think about the scenario. We've all been in it plenty of times. You have a presentation coming up. And you know it's coming, maybe it's 2 weeks from now, and you've been thinking about it a lot, right? We think about it while we're walking around campus. We think about it while we're walking the dog, doing other things. We think about it. But then there's always that moment where you have to start doing the thing, right? You have to start working on it. Now, if you are like, say 99% of people, when it's time to start working on your presentation, what's the first thing that you do? I'll bet you open up this, right? Because it's time to start working on the presentation. So you open up PowerPoint. and you start brainstorming. Maybe you start with your agenda slide. Maybe you open up your old folder of all your previous presentations and start copying and pasting stuff in. But you start within thinking about PowerPoint and adding things in and moving stuff around. This is the equivalent of sitting at the bottom of the mountain and looking up. All that you see are rocks and trees. All that you see are details. So the shift is I'd like to ask you, before you open PowerPoint, you go through this exercise where you ask yourself, and this could be on a whiteboard, a piece of paper, a Word document, I don't care where you do it, but I want you to ask yourself, what is the main message I want my audience to walk out of the room with? And then I want you to ask yourself, what would they need to know in order to get there? That's the first step. Once you do that, now you have a good basic outline that is driven by logic or driven by a purposeful viewpoint in mind. What happens, I think, and I believe that this step is one of the biggest contributors to presentations that overwhelm with detail and that lack coherence, I believe it's simply because we begin our thinking here. And it's so easy as an expert to just start putting details on slides, and then we start to move them around in a way that makes sense, but we haven't actually stepped back and looked at the bigger picture. I want you to begin with the big picture structure and then say, okay, what slides would I need now in order to support this story? That's an easy shift to make, actually. I mean, again, that's 10 minutes or less. The result will be very different from the step of just opening up with PowerPoint. And here's why I think this is so powerful. If you are in a position where you are trying to convince people, all right, give any sort of convincing or persuasive presentation, when you have a clear logical structure that leads to a viewpoint that someone understands how they arrived, where they did, they can retrace the path, when you have that, you have a much greater likelihood of convincing somebody, because a confused mind is always a no mind. And that's what's important for people to recognize, that if your audience is confused, the default will be no. People don't say, well, I didn't quite get that, but sure, we'll go with it. That's not what happens. And so this strategy allows you to make a clear logical progression up a path where people arrive at an outcome and then they can recreate for themselves in their mind, here's why I would believe what I believe. That's a much greater opportunity in order to convince others. And now finally, once we've done all of these things, all right, so we've gotten 2 tools so far, now we're ready to open up PowerPoint. All right, and when we open up PowerPoint, I'm going to really be challenging you to think a little bit differently about what it is that you choose to put on your slides, because I think we have got a big problem. All right, and that problem looks something like this. Haven't we all been in many presentations with speakers that are accompanied by things much like what you're seeing here on the screen? In fact, I think that so many presentations really are crime scenes, all right, when it comes to the amount of bullets that we have there. And here's the thing. If you want to know what's the damage, well, this is what it looks like when an idea is dying, all right? When you have a key stakeholder that is not invested in the work, this is what the costs look like. And I believe that what we're doing on our slides is contributing to this. But here's the great news. This is a huge opportunity. When I think about presentations and I think about the lowest hanging fruit, meaning something that you could change immediately to have a positive impact right away on your communication skills, this is it. So, how many people recognize what's here? What is this? What is it? PowerPoint. Specifically what from PowerPoint? Master template, exactly. All right, it is my belief, and so I'll put all my cards on the table here early, all right, for this section of the conversation. It is my belief that this, the default master template of PowerPoint, is the most significant barrier to the effective communication of your research that you have to overcome. All right, this one's a big deal. Now, why do I say that? Well, I find that a lot of people are not familiar with the history of PowerPoint, so let me give you a really quick origin story. All right, don't worry, I know everybody's like, oh God, the history of PowerPoint. Like, that does sound soul-killingly boring, I know. All right, but I promise it's going to be really quick, and it's actually really important for the thinking I'm going to ask you to do next. So you may or may not recall, but before we had the fancy computers and projectors, the way that presentation slides were given were overhead transparencies. Now, all you need to know about that is that it wasn't a great technology, all right? And so that meant that the technology, or the presentation slide space was ripe for an entrepreneur. It was ready for an innovation. Enter a guy named Robert Gaskins. Robert Gaskins was an entrepreneur, saw a need or an opportunity, saw that, hey, slides and transparencies aren't that great. Now, the late 80s is the rise of personal computers in business, right? This is now where people are having access to computers as part of their everyday work lives. And he said, you know, if I could create a software that people could use to design slides, that might be useful. So he created in 1987 what became known as PowerPoint. You are seeing here the original default master template from the first version of PowerPoint created in 1987. Now, as you know, we get new versions every couple of years, even more frequently now with Office 365. So here's where we are today. I know this is funny. It's true. So this is a full evolution, all right, of the default master template of PowerPoint, but here's the problem. It's not much of one, right? We essentially, 32 years later, still have the same basic default template and the slides that result from that. So your question might become, well, so what? Like, maybe he just nailed it, right? And I mean, there's a variety of ways that I can respond to that, but here's the two things I think every user of this tool should know. This information comes from Gaskins himself. There are several sources that you can refer to if you want to know more about this. I think the best one is the book that he wrote in 2012 called Sweating Bullets, all right, which was the memoir to the creation of PowerPoint. And it's about this thick. It is not a page turner. All right, but I will summarize it, the two things I think matter to a user just like you. All right, the first is that Gaskins had no idea what he was going to create. He thought that he would sell this tool to a company or two in Silicon Valley that would use it as internal company software. He never envisioned that a little company called Microsoft came along early on. They purchased the rights to PowerPoint, and they immediately bundled it into the Office software suite. So he never really saw that coming. And that's the impact that we still feel today, because what that meant is that overnight, this became the only available worldwide distributed slide design software. Current estimates, and this is as of this year from Microsoft, they estimate that PowerPoint has a 95% market share of all slides designed. It's not even close. The other 5% are things like Keynote, Prezi, Google Slides, all those things that we kind of feel like are these emerging technologies, and yeah, they sure are, but this is still the tool that the world's companies, institutions, and universities use. Secondly, right, and the second thing that I think that you should know, he said when he created this tool and this template, he said he didn't do any research. Think of that for a second. He said he was trying to get something out to market quickly. He thought that his end user that he had in mind was someone in a sales department at a company. And he thought, hey, they could use this points structure to list the selling points of their product. Also keep in mind in the late 80s, computers did not yet have the robust graphics capabilities that we're so used to now. So it was easy to program in text. And so that's what he did. Here's the problem. Fast forward 32 years. That little template that was not based in research by the admittance of the creator of it himself is continuing to have an impact on the slides that we see every day all around us. Now, a big question that I get is that, well, surely we wouldn't have done it this way for 32 years if it didn't work. And there's a variety of ways that I've responded to that, but ultimately this is what I think is happening. So probably some of you have heard of lemmings before. So if you've heard of lemmings, the reason lemmings are famous, even though this is a myth, all right, by the way, so here's a public service announcement, but the reason that that lemmings are famous is lemmings are these little rodents that are kind of famous for being so attached to their group that if one, for example, were to run off a cliff, the entire herd will follow and they'll all die. That's actually not true. It is a myth, but here's what is true and useful for our purposes. Psychology has coined a term called the lemming effect. And here's what the lemming effect poses. The lemming effect poses that we will follow one another even if it's to our own detriment or demise. So as I look at the world of presentations, this is what I see. All right, I think that we have a giant, and I mean giant on the global scale, lemming effect at work. I think that this starts early. I think it begins right in universities, just like this one, and it's not just this one, it's everywhere, where we come up through our classes. How do we see our professors present? Often like this. We join a research lab. Maybe we get a lab template. This is how we present in this lab. We go to a conference or a meeting. We see the best people in our field present. How do they present? Like this. Maybe we go and work in industry. We join a company. I guarantee you, week 1, here's the company template. Right? This is how you'll present this company. So here's what we have. We have everyone looking at everyone else to say, how do I give a competent, credible presentation of my work? And what that has resulted in is a self-reinforcing cycle where, hey, this is how I've always done it, so if I have the chance to teach somebody else, this is how I'm going to teach them to do it. And then anybody that steps outside of that, well, that's not how that's supposed to look. And as a group, we try to get them back in. And so here's what you can picture for the remainder of this conversation. Picture me standing at the edge of this cliff. My goal is to turn you back. All right? But if you decide to turn back, I don't want it to be because I say that you should. Right? I want it to be because the research says that you should. Because I believe that it is a huge problem that we have built 32 years of presentations on a template that results in slides that are fairly text heavy. And what I mean by that is they have a phrase headline supported by a bulleted list. That's what I mean when I say a typical slide. We have built 32 years of presentations on that general style that is not based in research. And I think we can do better than that. And so that's where I'd like to go now. I'd like to teach you 2 principles from the field of cognitive psychology. All right, so this is the field of how people learn, how people process information, that I think if every presenter just knew these 2 things, and you thought about them the next time you opened up slide design software, this would put you in a much stronger place in where your presentations actually end up. So here we go. Principle 1. Let's say I've got a speaker and an audience. Right now I'm a speaker. Right? You're my audience. Your brain is having to process the words coming out of my mouth, right? In addition, your brain has to process anything that I might put on the slide. Now, it does not matter whether I say the words and you hear them, or whether I project the words on a traditional slide and you read them. Words-based information is processed in roughly the same part of the brain. Now, haven't we all had the experience of being in a typical presentation, just like this one? And I'd like to ask you, when that slide comes up, what do you do? And I'm going to give you 3 choices. So raise your hand when you hear the one that you think most suits you. Everybody falls in nearly always to one of these 3 groups. All right, group 1, when that slide comes up, you read that slide. You tune out presenter and read slide. How many people do that? Yep, that's about what I expect, about half the room. All right, that's usually the biggest group. Now, group 2, this is my group, by the way, exact opposite of that. I will never read a slide that looks like that. I listen to the presenter. How many people do that? Yep, that's about what I'd expect. And then here's the 3rd group. If you didn't quite relate to either of those, you're probably in group 3. Group 3 is tennis group. All right, tennis group is back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, where you like skim the slide, you look for the bold or interesting information, then you listen to the presenter, are they saying anything useful? Anybody do tennis? Yeah, good. Okay, here's the thing. Does not matter at all which group you are in, but they are all evidence of the first principle that I want you to know. And that is that there is a limit to how much words-based information we can process. When we reach that limit, it's called cognitive overload. So all that I just asked you was, how do you experience cognitive overload and automatically control for it? Because notice what nobody said and what nobody ever says is that I simultaneously and harmoniously streamed in perfectly both the words of the slide and the words of the speaker. Nobody says it because our human brain is not wired to do it. Everybody says something along the lines of I control one flow of information or I control the other. That's because we are actively trying to guard against this cognitive overload. Cognitive overload is just like a traffic jam, all right, on the words-based part of the brain. But meanwhile, we've got this traffic jam, and then we've got a whole separate area, a whole separate highway into the brain standing completely open, and that's our opportunity, and that's the focus of principle 2, all right? So now let's say I have a technical term to explain to you. All right, so I picked something from mechanical engineering. If you're not a mechanical engineer, this will be a term that maybe is unfamiliar to you. If I want to explain what a fillet is, I know it looks like filet, I promise, it's pronounced fillet. All right, I learned that the hard way. So if I want to explain in front of a room of mechanical engineers, if I want to explain what a fillet is, all right, here's my choices, right? I can talk about what a fillet is. I could also project a traditional, typical slide. And as I've already covered, I'm going to be at a high risk of cognitive overload for my audience. But here's my other choice. I could talk about what a fillet is while showing a relevant visual to go along with my verbal explanation. Fillets are interesting to me because they're a design feature used in engineering that helps an object to move more efficiently through a fluid. The reason I think they're interesting is they're inspired by nature. So fillets are naturally seen. They're the slant that you can see indicated here in the yellow circle. They're the slant on the dorsal fin of a shark. And what scientists have observed is that over the course of evolution, the fillets on sharks have become more pronounced so that they can swim faster and catch more prey. Engineers have used this same design as inspiration for the design of things like submarines to help those to move more efficiently through the water. They also use them on the turbine blades in a jet engine to help the air to flow more efficiently downstream. Now, the work of Richard Mayer, who is the most published cognitive psychologist in the area of multimedia learning, his work would say that because I've shown you a relevant visual image to go along with my verbal explanation, you are now twice as likely to remember that information. Not a little bit more likely, twice as likely. And that's because visual information is processed in a separate part of the brain and it's processed much more deeply. So, those two principles I just taught you, that's, by the way, that's known in the literature as a picture superiority effect, all right? So I just taught you two things, the principle of cognitive overload and the picture superiority effect. Now, if we map those onto our default template that influences so strongly the style of the slides that we design, I hope you're coming to a realization, which is not only does this not work with those principles, it actively runs against them. And that's a big deal, because those two things I taught you, you should know, are not new and they're not controversial. Those are well agreed upon, well established, well studied basic principles of how the human brain functions. So all that I'm saying is that we should take what we know over here about how people learn and process information, and we should apply that over here to our slide design, because I would think that we want our audiences to learn and process information. I don't think that's a crazy idea, but it turns out it's not one that's happening that much, which is why I get to do a lot of this type of cool work, because as soon as you apply a research-based approach, you should be unsurprised to find that it will immediately improve the way that people relate to your presentations. So here's how I'd like to finish here in the last 5 minutes or so. I'd like to teach you what is called the assertion evidence slide design. All right, so I'm going to give you a basic primer in these final 5 minutes, and then we can talk about more things if you have questions about it during the fireside chat. So you're seeing an example here of an assertion evidence slide, and just as the name implies, it has two key elements, the assertion and the evidence. This slide design strategy has its research home at Penn State University. I was very lucky to spend the first 10 years of my career as a faculty member at Penn State, where I was a part of this research team. This team is led by Professor Michael Alley, who's still there doing excellent work in this area, and he's the lead researcher on many of the studies as they relate to this particular slide design strategy. So as we dive in, there's just two elements or two key best practices for an assertion evidence slide. The first is that I'd like you to become aware of the difference between having a topic at the top of the slide, which is probably what you've done up to this point, and now I'd like you to think about having a takeaway message. All right, that's step one. So we're moving from a topic to a takeaway message in the title space of the slide. That takeaway message should take the form of a full sentence headline. All right, so full sentence headline, that sentence should convey the takeaway message. Think of it as, what do I want my audience to know, understand, or remember as a result of this presentation, or as a result of this slide? And that's what you put at the top of it. Full sentence, all right, couple of other quick parameters, should be concise. I'll define concise as no longer than 2 lines and no smaller than 28-point font. So if you can type at the top of each slide a full sentence that states what you want the audience to know, remember, or understand as a result of the slide, if you can have that be no longer than 2 lines and have it be no smaller than 28-point font, you have checked all of my basic criteria for having an assertion on the slide. So that's the how, but let's talk about the why. Here's why this matters. When you are forced to think about a full sentence on each slide, what that does is it drives a much deeper level of thinking about the work, and it drives a much more filtered and focused approach. Because if this is the idea that I want my audience to know as a result of this slide, overall survival showed a trend towards poorer prognosis for triple-negative and luminal tumors, that's a very complete thought. That brings instant filter and instant focus to the slide. That tells me this is the data I'd want to put on there in order to support this. It's easiest to look at what it's not. Here's what we typically do instead. We put a phrase or a topic at the top. And here's why this is such a big difference. I want you to think about how this impacts preparation. Because it is my contention that when we prepare and think via takeaways, it drives a much deeper level of thinking about the work, and the result is a much more filtered and focused presentation. So here's what we normally do. We sit at our computer. All right, at this stage of the talk, going green. So we sit and we think about that topic. Well, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this. Very quickly, we end up with a slide that looks like this. So when we think via topics, topics are too big of a bucket. Too big of a category. Lots of things fit into the topic of going green. Put another way, this is a slide with too many fish. And the problem with a slide like this, the reason it's so dangerous, is that a slide like this gives the speaker the illusion of content. Because you feel like you've got all your bases covered here. Right? Every question that somebody might ask, every detail they might want, everything you might want to remember to say, we feel like it's all here. Here's the problem. When a speaker gets up in front of the room just like this, and now they have a slide like this accompanying them, what happens is the speaker has to wrestle with that takeaway live. They have to start to assimilate what they already talked about, what they're talking about coming up next, and now they have to figure out in the midst of all of that, what am I actually trying to say? And that is why so many presentations of research lack clarity and coherence. I believe it begins at the preparation phase. So simply front-loading the thought process, which is wrestle with a full sentence takeaway message. By the way, I say wrestle because you're going to find that this is much harder than you expect. I have not presented a rocket science idea here, all right? All that I said was have a full sentence at the top of your slide, right? That's not like, that's pretty easy stuff to get. You're going to find that in practice, it's much more challenging than you expect, and that's a good thing because it's going to force you to do harder thinking at the preparation phase. And then here's the final piece. Now that you've got that full sentence takeaway, ask yourself what would be visual evidence for that message. So visual evidence can be so many things. Charts, graphs, tables, equations, lines of computer code, calendars, maps, timelines. I mean, there are so many things that count. The easiest is just to make sure that it's not a bulleted list. All right, that is what I'm asking you to move away from. Bulleted lists, I believe, are tremendously problematic for two reasons. I already gave you one. When you have too much text on the slide, you have an audience that is now dealing with that cognitive overload. But secondly, bulleted lists are a poor way to show information because bulleted lists do not show relationships or connections. And when we put our information like this, we actually hide or obscure the relationships or connections between the things that our audience needs to have. Now, I know that some people get a little bit anxious because they think, well, I need something on the slide to remind me what to say. And so I'm not saying you can't have any text on the slide. What I would like to recommend is something more like this. Use it as call-outs or key features, all right, of the visual evidence. And so I'll just conclude here with just a few examples, all right, of assertion evidence slides. These are all real examples. I've been given permission to show these in a public forum like this. And all that I want you to see as I click through these is I'd like you to pay attention, again, full sentence takeaway message about the research at the top, supported by visual evidence. Notice the different types of visual evidence. Notice the use of text on the body of the slide, that it's fairly minimal, but it's used as a call-out or a key feature of the visual evidence. And now, when we move to this type of slide strategy and we start to illustrate our ideas this way, we have completely changed the relationship between speaker, slide, and audience. Because now, the audience can listen to the speaker describe the complex visual evidence that's being shown here, tell the story about the work, and they can both seamlessly listen and look at the screen without having to do that ping-pong effect, that back and forth, listen, read, listen, read, listen, read. So we've completely changed the flow of information, which is why this ends up and is so powerful for an audience that experiences a presentation in this particular strategy. So ultimately, this is why I think this matters, all right? Slides are the vehicle for your ideas. And I just think we've been doing this in a very outdated way, all right? And there's better technology available. And that's one idea that I've shared with you today. Your action item is to think about that assertion evidence strategy. And so as we go ahead and wrap up this part of the conversation, I hope that I've made good, all right, on my promise at the beginning, which was to give you practical, actionable tools, all right, to narrow the gap. Today I've taught you 3 things that there should be 0 ramp time for. You should walk out of that door and be able to do them right away. The first was interpret your work. All right, don't just report on the work, interpret your work. Here's what I found, here's why it matters. All right, that was the first one. Secondly, when it's time to prepare a presentation, don't just start by opening up PowerPoint and starting to just go through all those details. It's the equivalent of sitting at the bottom of the mountain and looking up. First, do the exercise of asking yourself, what is the view I want to achieve? Where would my audience need, what would they need to know in order to get there? So do that offline first, then go to PowerPoint. And then finally, challenge that default master template. We must do better in that area. The number one test, I gave you one strategy and one formula, that's the assertion evidence strategy, but if nothing else, think about this. Does my slide do something for me that my words cannot? If it's text only, you don't need it. All right, you've got the text part covered by speaking. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn my formal remarks, and I wish you all the best of luck in acting these things. I think that it matters because your research deserves it. I want to make sure that your work moves forward because someone is able to understand and appreciate the value of what it brings to solving so many of the challenging problems that face our world today. So I want to thank you for being a part of the conversation. I know we're going to take a short break, about 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back and continue with some more informal Q&A. So get your questions ready, and we'll come back in just a few minutes. Thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you. Great, thanks.
All right, everybody. Here's the next part of the plan here. If you have cards with questions, pass them toward the middle. We're going to roam the aisles and we'll grab them or pass them. Either way, we'll get them. We're going to go through them. Please stick around. The fireside chat opportunity to just have a discussion is going to be great. And if you want to move forward a little closer, that's perfect. If you're happy where you are, great. Feel free to shuffle around a little bit. We're just going to take a couple minutes, reset where the chairs are, and then we'll get started on that. Thanks for being here.
feel like I'm on Oprah. This is great. I feel like I should be holding some cards. They don't have anything on them, but do I look important?
Exactly. All right, everybody, let's get started on this. First of all,
Great. Fiona,
Melissa,
right?
thank you so much for sharing all of those thoughts. This is an area that's a real passion area for, well, everybody on this stage, I know, because we know how important it is to talk about your research, because your research matters. And I think this is such a great way of starting to think about why your research matters and how do you connect with an audience. And so that's going to be, I'm sure, a part of this discussion as we go on. My name is Mike Hooker. I'm Director of Public Affairs and Communications at CSU. I spent over 2 decades in journalism as a news reporter in television prior to coming to the university. So I spent a lot of time whittling stories down into just the nugget of what they're about and really thinking about why does this matter to an audience. Maybe if we can just go down the row and introduce the two of you as well, and then we can just start a conversation. And we really would like this to be a conversation, so feel free to interrupt, feel free to interject. We've got some questions from the cards, and hopefully we'll just have a great fireside chat without a fire, but if any of you inventors can make us a fire.
Hi everyone, so I'm Amanda Cook and I'm a PhD student. I'm a 5th year PhD student in the biochemistry and molecular biology department. And I really do love science, but I found this passion for science communication and I'm really diving into the importance of it. And so I'm just super happy to be here. Thank you, Melissa, for your great talk. And yeah, I'm interested to see what questions you all have as well.
Hi, I'm Dylan Parker. I'm also a 5th year grad student in biochemistry and molecular biology. I've also kind of stumbled through science into finding a passion for communication, particularly trying to get involved in the policy side of communication, so communicating to some stakeholders who aren't, involved in the university as much and trying to increase their engagement.
Excellent.
We all know Melissa. But.
Yeah, I'm Melissa. I care a lot about eradicating the world of bullet points.
We each have our own microphone. It's very, very fancy here. I know, let's just get this started, and I think you both have just some great launching points for the discussion.
So one of the original questions that we wanted to ask was there a moment that you had when you realized that this was super important, and what did that look like for you?
Yes, it actually is one of those things where I can pinpoint when I started to, when the lightning bolt happened for me. So my background, the way I began my career, so my undergraduate and graduate studies are in communication, all right? So I'm not a scientist or an engineer or any of those things. I'm a communication expert by academic training, and then my faculty appointment was in communication at Penn State. And so what I was tasked with there was teaching public speaking classes. So we have a general education requirement for public speaking courses. That was what I did for the first 2 years. And then along the way, what happened was College of Engineering at Penn State bubbled up with this challenge that they were seeing that their students were going through the general education class, the public speaking class that was being taught to all kinds of students. I mean, it was enormous class. And they would go out to their internships for the summer, and when they would get feedback from employers would say, Penn State engineering students are awesome technically, and they're poor at their communication skills. So when they talk about their projects at the end of the summer, that kind of thing. And so then what the College of Engineering did was they did some studies, they pulled the transcripts after getting this feedback, and they saw that there was no difference whether the students had taken the public speaking course or the communications course or not. They still got bad feedback, and that was a problem, all right, that they said, because as you certainly know, those of you in the maybe an engineering curriculum specifically at Penn State, that is a really tight curriculum. There's a lot that they have to get through, and so we had a whole general education class that was 3 credits, which is a lot, for public speaking, and they said, this is not great. If we're doing this, we're allotting this, and we're not seeing any payoff. So what happened was, Penn State said, or communication said, all right, we'll see what we can do, and the groups decided was we'll pilot a class that still covers the general education public speaking requirement, but it's going to have a focus on communicating technical information. Mine was the name that bubbled up. all right, to teach and to develop that class and pilot it. And the reason that my name bubbled up was that I had sort of a bit of a reputation for being relentlessly practical. And what I mean by that is that I was in a very, my department was the Department of Rhetoric, very liberal arts focused, and that was awesome and great, but I was very much like, okay, it's cool that we're looking at these principles, but how can they be applied to what we're trying to do right now, in the real world? And so that was something I was sort of well known for. So they said, this is a real world application, go and do that. So I was in the first week of that class. I developed this course, and I started talking to the students and hearing about the amazing work that they were doing, the research that they were doing. And then they were like, oh, like someone I remember had this unbelievable idea for improving bridge design in third world countries, and they're like, yeah, I even tried to get a little project going and get just a little bit of funding from an organization, and nobody even had any questions or even understood what I was talking about. And I asked a few questions because I'm not afraid to ask a dumb question. It's one of my strengths in this field. And so I started talking to him, and this was just a communications issue. His idea was good. And that was the first week of that class, and I was like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So from that moment forward, I relentlessly focused on how to communicate complex technical ideas to audiences that don't have the same background. I've never looked back since.
Actually, that strikes me as something that I see a connection with things that I hear when a scientist or researcher really lights something up. A lot of times it goes back to what got you into this, right? And even just hearing you talk about that, you go, oh man, I am so excited to be a science communicator. Is there value in that type of storytelling, in sharing why your science matters?
Yes, I think so, because I think that at our most, from a communications perspective, humans are storytelling animals. All right, and so we connect greatly with one another, and we connect greatly with stories as we hear from one another. And that's one of the big challenges, especially as I'm working with people in technical fields, is I'm constantly trying to push for tell a story, and it's because I think that we're getting sometimes we get so removed from the work that we're presenting it so clinically that we lose why we feel something about it. And I think that, I'm not saying that we only drive with how we feel about something, but I am saying that a successful communication is a human-to-human interaction. And when we take that away by being so clinical, here's our dry facts, here's our, and we don't allow our audience to see why we care, why we're motivated to do this, and a lot of that happens through stories. I think that we miss an opportunity. And so often we're afraid to allow people to see that part of ourselves because we think that somehow we'll lose credibility, right? If I share about why I'm excited about this or why I'm doing this, or even just a funny, goofy story of something that happened, in the lab. There's all these things that, as humans, we're just all going about trying to work it out each day, whether we're in our lab or we're with our colleagues. And I think that audiences respond marvelously to authentic humans in front of a room that also have some important science to share.
Is there a reluctance, I don't know if any of you have a thought on this, is there a reluctance to be human? And if so, why? Or is it just a matter of being shy? Yeah.
One of my speech classes too, one of the most important or hardest things at the end was to do a speech with humor. I think there's a thing about using humor, but then it falling flat and not being funny when you're trying to be funny.
Right.
So I think stories are good, but when you try and inject humor, which is also really important in some I think the best speeches, even when best presentations have humor, if it doesn't go well, it's really scary.
Yeah, and I would, what I always say about humor too is that don't force it. Right, so if that doesn't come naturally to you, that is one of a myriad of emotions that you can access. And so if it doesn't come naturally to you, that's okay. That doesn't mean that you won't be successful. And also, I think that the best humor is the ones that can work. I think the most effectively is humor that is self-reflexive. So humor that's back at you. All right, because it's by the way, that's the safest humor. Right? Because you have to be very careful when your humor points outward, then you run some different risks. So if you want to dabble in humor, right, which I know a lot of people do, I get that question actually. A lot of people say we know we like it, when speakers are humorous, but I think it's important to stay within your authentic wheelhouse, whatever that is for you, which is what are you comfortable with? And then if you decide you'd like to try some humor, self-reflexive humor, stuff that points back at yourself, something that happened in your lab or something that, the mistake you made, that's the safest humor if you want to dabble with that. Yeah.
I also think it's almost a little frowned upon, too, in some areas of science when you're presenting. I tend to be humorous when I present, and sometimes I do get a little bit of like, hey, maybe you should do that, and I can't help it because I like to engage my audience.
Yeah.
As you can see, I'm very handsy. But yeah, I get discouraged from it, which I think makes it harder for people to want to do that.
I think a good rule of thumb if you're trying to, so maybe what has occurred if you're being discouraged from it, it may be that you violated the signal to noise ratio, all right? And so that's a really great thing for everybody to think about. Whether it's really anything that you're doing in your presentation, ask yourself about signal to noise ratio. So signal should be, what's the message I'm trying to get across? And we, in general, want to try to minimize noise. So if you use humor, it should be directed towards the message that you're trying to get across. Shouldn't just be superfluous, all right? That's why what happens when we put like stupid cartoons, right, that don't have anything to do, like, well, I just thought the audience would be bored at this point, so I put a Far Side cartoon, right? I mean, that's adding noise, right? If you're going to use a cartoon, make sure it's something that is relevant to the message you're trying to get across. So I think that's, if you're trying to decide, ask yourself about signal to noise ratio. That can be helpful. And I've responded actually the same way to that. When you think about this credibility issue, which I think is a big deal. I think it's a good question because I'm really, the mark that I ultimately really hope that I leave with my contributions to this field is that I really get people thinking differently about what they're putting on the screen. I think that is the most broken thing that we have right now in science communication. And I have been amazed at how hard it is to get people to change that. Absolutely blown away by it. I thought when I came across a lot of this work and started to see how clear the research is on it, I already have I had all these other ideas. I was like, well, good, I'm going to fix the slides for the world, and then I'm going to go and I had all these other things that I'm going to do, and it's 10 years now. I'm still working on the slides. Right? So I really underestimated how deeply entrenched this was, and it's for that exact reason. When I say remove the bullets. Now I'm not saying have just pretty pictures, right? Visual evidence. But people will say, still, that's not how we get, I get pushback all the time. And I'm just, working to outlast that because I think that the people that are willing to be bold and to be brave, to challenge the status quo, see immediate payback. That's the thing. Everybody says, oh, no, don't do it, that will be credible, that will be credible. And then there's the person, and now it's a lot of people, that say, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. And then they get up on the stage, and all of a sudden, everybody at the conference is like, that was the best presentation I ever saw. And here's the thing, just when you change the slides, nobody will know that's what changed. That's the craziest part. People just know that was a better presentation. They say things like, wow, I got a lot out of that. That speaker really seemed to know what they were talking about. Nobody ever says, where were the bullets? It just doesn't happen. So be bold with challenging some of those conventions.
Dylan, I might ask you to sort of relay there's a couple different categories of the cards that people send in, which some of them are about, how do you transform science into a story? How do you come up with your main theme? And then there's also some practical questions about, should I memorize my talk or things like that. I'm wondering if either for you and your experience, if either of those big subject areas resonates with you for some of the questions you might have.
So personally, I think one of the things I was interested in is when I was first starting as an early career researcher, I had a really hard time kind of weaving basic research into a story when it felt incredibly incomplete. So I think trying to figure out different ways that you can weave something that's very nascent and very new into a complete story would be really nice. And then as far as actually memorizing talks, I've always been way too off the cuff. So I think it's probably a good practice, but I've never been too worried about it.
Well, so I think that it's a big task to sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to become a storyteller, right? That's, I think, is a honed skill set. So I'll give you two things. All right, so one is a long-term goal, all right, and a long-term resource. An excellent resource that I would recommend for thinking about storytelling and strategy for storytelling is a book called Resonate, all right, by Nancy Duarte. That is an excellent book that I would absolutely recommend. And then she has another one. It just came out. I'm kidding. I have it it just came out a month ago. I think it might be called Data Story, actually. So Nancy Duarte, same thing. Look for, it has data in the title. If anybody, actually, somebody Google it right now so you can tell me. I put my phone, look how good I am. It's not in my pocket, now I wish I had it. But somebody Google Nancy Duarte and her new book right now. It has data in the title. That's another one that I'm halfway through it, and I think that one's even more specific. So Resonate was kind of, what's that? Data Story, good, all right, great. So Data Story by Nancy Duarte. I'm only halfway in, so if it just goes to crap in the second half, I don't know, because I haven't read the whole thing. It's brand new, but I think it's pretty compelling. And Data Story, so it's talking a lot about how to create from your research a data point of view. And so I think that those two resources would be excellent long-term developing ideas. Quick action item, all right, in addition to those, would be a great way to already start to give a storytelling sense in a presentation is balance your analytical and emotional appeals. We almost always, if you looked at the types of supporting material, meaning how you talk about things in a presentation of your research, I'll bet nearly all of it is analytical information. It's facts, findings, case studies. It's all this stuff that's very analytical. And so to bring an additional feeling to it, additional storytelling piece, also balance out. It doesn't have to be exactly 50-50, but add emotional appeals. Now, I'm not saying you're trying to make everybody weep. What I'm saying is you're trying to make them feel something in the presentation, right? So emotional appeals, what causes an emotional appeal? Well, you could have a story, just tell a story about somebody that was impacted, maybe by what your research is. Tell a story about what you saw in the lab. It could be suspense. Ask some of the interesting questions. Say, we are really perplexed by this. That was actually, I traveled around the symposium today, and that's a question that I ask. I say, what surprised you? And if you can do things like that in the presentation, that causes people, it invokes the emotion of curiosity. So use pieces of supporting material that invoke an emotion, all right, on many different spectrums for the audience. That's a way to immediately have a more engaging storytelling feel as you start to work then on your bigger question, the narrative arc. You can do that right away.
So I was curious, how do you recommend us develop a style? How have you seen that in action? Is it just giving more presentations and then figuring out what works for you?
I think that definitely the biggest thing, and this is never advice that anybody likes, but I'll give it to you anyway, which is to improve your presentation skills and then to ultimately develop what is a style that you feel comfortable and confident with, you have to just present more. I mean, you have to look for more and more opportunities. That's why I think it's so great that everybody had to stand out there and talk about their work. I mean, there's no substitute. You can only think about it for so long, and there's no substitute for actually doing it. And so my biggest advice to those of you early in your career is to look for more opportunities to present. And that's so counterintuitive. It's why nobody likes this advice, because we also all have a fair amount of, if you're like 98% of people, right, you probably have a fair amount of anxiety when it comes to presenting. It's a stressful situation, it's a lot of work, and so what that means is, especially early on in your career, because it's stressful, it's a lot of work, you already have enough stress and enough work, you are constantly looking for ways to avoid having to present. And so if you'd like in 10 years from now to be one of the awesome communicators in your field, that starts now. Because right now you have a lot of opportunities to talk about things in low stakes or no stakes environments. All right, you can talk about your work to campus clubs, you can talk about your work to your lab, you can talk about your work when alumni come, volunteer to be somebody that speaks about those things. I know that that's uncomfortable and unpleasant, but those are all scenarios in which you can actively fail and nothing will happen. All right, and here's the other thing, you won't fail. You feel like you will, but you won't. But those are all scenarios in which you can actively get that experience, and the people that 10 years from now are awesome communicators are building that resume and that repertoire now. That's how you learn what's comfortable for you. That's how you learn your style. There's just simply no replacement for getting, for getting that type of experience. And I'll also say from a career perspective, it's something that you must do because ultimately the credit goes, even if it's a group project, all right? The credit goes to the person standing there with it up on the stage. It's just a fact. And so I find that to be tremendously important for you to realize, which is that when the group is all sitting down like this, like, well, all right, guys, we did a thing, but somebody's going to have to go and, talk about it. Be the one who's like, yeah, absolutely, I'll totally do that, right? Because that is the way to get yourself out in front of a lot of this, because somebody has to do it. It might as well be you.
That's got to raise some questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Another way to accomplish that is something from your lives or your professor's life. Offer to teach this class.
You bet.
Her class.
There are so many scenarios right now. I mean, you will never have more low-stakes opportunities to get speaking experience than you do right now.
In a practical takeaway standpoint, too, I mean, watching your presentation, I know I've got like 2 different presentations I'm working on right now, and I do try and do a lot of what you spoke about reinforces things I try, but not to the degree that I could do more of it. And so I'm going to go home tonight and play with like 2 slides, right? Just to see, okay, when we do this presentation, how does this one slide work compared to what I was going to do? And I think that's the great thing about this kind of conversation too, is that we're not talking about building a whole new presentation. We're not talking about doing a whole new line of research. We're talking about something we can do this afternoon in how we relate what it is we care about to what someone else cares about.
Absolutely.
And so it's super, that's just I find that super refreshing in this kind of conversation, is I can go, oh, there's a thing I'll do this afternoon.
Yeah. There should be zero ramp time for these things. These are things you can do immediately. Thank you.
So relating to what I care about, what someone else cares about, without an application motivation seems really difficult. So how can I motivate, or I guess what would be a good way to represent how I motivate my research for research's sake, not because it could potentially down the line have an application that people then care about, like a solar cell or an LED.
Well, I think that in my experience, you'd have to, I think that, that's sort of interesting because what, sort of the undertone of what I hear a little bit is that, so you love basic research, is that right? For the sake of basic research. Yeah, so I say, why do you love that? Because your voice actually changed when you talked about that, and then you're like, then there's the application. Solar cells. Right? What was so what for you is the exciting piece, right, about the basic research?
Is knowing how and why things work the way that they do is important, not because they are eventually going to have an application, but because it's interesting. People should care about what I'm doing, not because it could be an application.
Yeah. So why do you think that that I should care about basic research? So it's knowing. Why do you think I should care about that?
I think a lot of basic research is building blocks to the bigger problems that people are answering in the industry and how they're scaling things up. But a lot of what they're doing comes from basic research roots.
There you go. Okay. So what we just did there is a version of, you didn't know, you were stepping into a trap. Gotcha. So what we just did there was a version of what I call the so what game, which is I ask people always when they have those types of challenges, so what? So what? And I do it now I didn't have to do it because you got me to a place that I can talk about something I think that's useful. But sometimes I will do that to the absurd, which is eventually we end up with the so what, which is we want to, we don't want people to die, right? It's yes, that is why it's important to, research medicine, right? And so that's like a, sort of a ridiculous application. But what is critical about what you said, the so what that I think would matter to any audience, right? Because I was trying to get from where you are to the so what that matters to an audience. And that picture of what you do is the building blocks or the foundation. So it doesn't matter if I care, I may care deeply, all right, about solar cells. And what you've just told me is that we can never be at that pinnacle of developing the most awesome solar cell unless I do the work that I need to do right now, right? I'm the one that's laying the foundation or the building blocks. And that's a picture. So I think that what your challenge likely is, if you don't want to have to default to the application, right? If you don't want to have to default and you want to stay in the beautiful sparkle, right, of basic science research, if you want to stay there, then what I think you have to do is you have to help people to have the same vision you do. They need to see what you see, which is why this matters, and it matters because we cannot achieve those other things that people get really excited about if we don't have the things that you're trying to do. We have to understand those things in order to have something to build on. You can't build on air, right? And so we have to have something to build on from there. I think that's a way that you can still make it relevant, that people can understand the vision that you have as well.
And on that note, one, I guess, a trap I could see falling over time, if you have a chance to talk about your science a lot, is that you then do develop sort of what is a you-centered reason to care. And I'm wondering, how do you freshen and always be aware of what, the way that the solar cells connect with this person may be different from the next person. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that customization of being really audience aware beyond sort of the obvious. We all care about eating, so let's have better food. Well, yeah, okay. But how do you do that in a way that really is being aware that even among the three of you, if I'm trying to say something I care about, it might be different to each one of you. Yeah. And I guess I'm wondering, do you have any tricks for honing in quickly to figure out where I'm going to connect?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. So I think there's a couple of ways to do it. I think that you can do it in a very authentic way. Actually, interestingly, somebody did this for me out in the poster symposium. I walked up to her and I said, tell me a little bit about your work. And she came right back and she said, how much do you know about lithium-ion batteries? Right? and I was like, well, I know that the only thing I know is that sometimes there's some problems with them, kind of being a little unstable. And she was like, yes, that's right. And so she used that. So I thought that was a really great technique, because what she did was immediately get a sense of something that I understood, and which wasn't much, is what she figured out pretty quickly, right? But that's useful information, as opposed to what she didn't do was just do the stock thing that she did for every person that walked up. She absolutely, in the moment, asked one question, got a quick sense where I was in the depth pool, and went from there. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. For some reason we feel like we have to sort of launch right in. And so I think that's something that's really helpful. I also think that almost everybody as presenters could benefit a bit more from what I call pre-game hustle, all right? So pre-game hustle is that there's a lot you can learn about audiences before you ever arrive to the scene. And for some reason, we never do any of that. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot that you can, if you're preparing for an upcoming conference or a meeting, ask the person that's organizing the meeting, who's going to be there, what's happening, why are they interested in this, why did you ask me? I mean, those are things that you can typically accomplish in an email to someone who is in an administrative or organizational role that gives you incredibly valuable insight. And all that takes is, that's why I call it the pre-game hustle, is just asking. You would be amazed. I mean, almost nobody does that. And that's not difficult to do. And that is another way that you can immediately get some insight into who is in the room. So those are basic things that I think anybody can do to try to be more audience-centered right away.
Greg.
I think we're all being very polite given the political climate that we're in right now. And so my question pertains to the political climate and the elephant in the room, which is you're giving a TED-like talk and somebody says, this is just fake news. How do you change your talk to be able to convince, and this again goes back to knowing your audience, how do you go back to be able to explain that, yes, I'm talking about common ground, but you may not even be on common ground, or what you thought was common ground. And now you're about to snorkel, but instead you find somebody putting their thumb in your snorkel. try to go down and
Yeah.
explain something a little more deeply, they say, it's fake news. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
How do you anticipate that prior to your giving your talk, your presentation to the audience, that there may be people who are going to have this point of view, and so you have extra slides or visuals, or do you just have to think on your feet and say, okay, you may believe that, however, how then do you disprove this? Or give them something that is even so familiar to them that they basically will look stupid to the audience to disbelieve it.
Well, if I could solve that problem, I'd be on, CNN or, God forbid, Fox News right now trying to do it, right? So the answer, so I don't know that I can get, or I'd be writing a book. I mean, I don't know. Like, we'd be taking the show on the road, Mike. Like, if we could, if we could fix that. That's a big question, okay? Let me give you a couple of things, in the practical space that might help without, I'm not going to be able to solve that big question because there are so many there's so many things in there. So one is, though, and actually what I think is actionable in this, aside, political stuff aside, is what do you do when you have an audience with a bias, right? That's actually that question in a nutshell, right? And so if you have an audience with a bias, what do you do? I think that one of the strongest things that we can do, and we know we have a strongly biased audience, one of the strongest things that we can do is identify that bias early on. So here's what people typically do, especially in research and in science. If we know we have a biased audience, we think it's because, well, they just don't have the right information yet. And I'm going to fix that by bringing them the information. And so you come to the presentation loaded with the facts, right? And you are ready to chuck those facts at the audience, because when they get that information, oh, okay, I totally get it now, right? That's what you think is going to happen. Bias is so strong. I actually love that about putting the thumb in the snorkel. I'm thinking about that one, actually. I think you helped me with my, I'll be thinking about that on the plane today. But anyway, so I always think of bias as like a physical wall, all right? It's a brick wall between you and the audience. You can bring all the facts you want. You start chucking them at the audience, and they just hit that wall and bounce right back. That is a tremendously unsatisfying experience and incredibly frustrating. One of the strongest things you can do, and it's easy, is right away name the bias for the room. Say, I know a lot of you come to this conversation with the following concern. I know a lot of you don't buy into it at all. As soon as you acknowledge it for the room, you take actually quite a lot of power away, because you say, I get it, and I'm still here to have that conversation. So it becomes something that you have now brought that back into a place that you're aware, you understand, I know, and it also actually creates a connection, because you can say, I know a lot of you are concerned that, or I know a lot of you think that, and today I've got some new information that I think might, cause something to be different. Now, people who are willfully obtuse, I don't know how we're going to fix that, all right? and I don't know, and but if I find out, stay tuned for the book, all right?
There's your takeaway phrases, willfully obtuse. I just want to give a quick time check here, because I know we are on a pretty tight schedule at the end of this, so we've got a couple more minutes. Yep. Before we get totally to the end of this, we do want to make sure to acknowledge a great day of grad show, and special thanks to the Provost's office as well as the Vice President for Research office for all of their support of helping you all share what it is that you do every day. And so it's been just a really special day in a lot of ways, and this has been a really good conversation. We have a couple more minutes to continue.
Yeah, one or two more questions maybe.
And Dylan, I was just thinking that we did get a lot of nice cards, and these two cards seem to sort of relate to one another. And I think you don't need to process why or how, but just if you want to maybe share those.
Yeah, so one of the questions is, how do you transform your science into a story, particularly conducting the science or making analogies potentially? And then also, as a communications professional, how can I work with faculty to help draw these impactful stories from people's research?
Yeah, I think, figuring out those pieces about how to engage in the story aspect. I mean, I think if you're somebody that's working in the communications field, and you are thinking about how do I draw those stories out. I think that part of what I did actually when I was talking to the person earlier about the basic research, I think using that, for example, the so what exercise is a great one because that starts to get people, figure out what people are excited about. And I also think that before you ever have to start to develop a communication or a presentation or whatever, sitting down, and I think it's really important to figure out if you're in a role where you're assisting people to share their message or share their stories, to figure out which parts are they excited about. So I always think about the things that are on so what are they really excited about, and then what are they really challenged by, right? Those are the kind of the two polar things. Those are places where things that are interesting reside. Right, so the stuff that people are, the successes and the things that they love and are really excited about, and then the things that are friction points. And any story will typically have a conflict, all right? And then, of course, the resolution to that conflict. So I think figuring out where the conflict is, and again, conflict can just be, I did ask a lot of people that, like, what was the most difficult thing, or I asked somebody that, when were you frustrated in this research? And someone told me, like, when I had to learn to code, like and she that was like, she showed a lot of emotion in that moment. I was thinking like that, but there's that's good raw material, because that's something that lots of people, I guarantee that was not just her, all right, that was difficult for the project, but that's difficult for a lot of people in that same way. So looking for those friction points, I think those are the types of things. If I was in a supporting role, or if I was working on it for myself, I would ask myself, where are the outliers? Where are the things that I'm glowing about, and where are the things that I'm just like gnashing my teeth about? That's where the interesting stuff lies, because that's where some of the emotion is.
This is probably a good chance to wrap up what could be a conversation that would go on and on and on. Did you have anything final, I guess as closing thoughts, that you wanted to share?
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for having the conversation, certainly. And I think that the biggest closing thought that I'd like you to walk away from this with is that, number one, doing this matters, right? Communicating your work well matters. I understand that it takes time and effort, and it's hard to do, but I think that it's a worthy endeavor. And then I'd also like to empower all of you, being especially so many early in your career, to be very aware of the status quo and whether that is serving your work well when it comes to communication. I don't know how else we are going to create change if we don't start somewhere by changing. And here's what I don't want. I often will do workshops, for example, for people who are well advanced in their careers, university faculty or people at companies who have been in their career for 20 years. And they'll go through a workshop with me, and I'll teach them in more depth some of the nuggets that I gave to you today. And you know what they say? They're like, yeah, I'm definitely going to do this. I wish I would have learned it 20 years ago. Right? And so for all of you that are at an earlier stage in your career, do not allow the fact that, well, this just isn't how people typically do it, to stop you from making some improvements. All right, because I believe that what we're typically doing, again, painting with a broad brush, but what we're typically doing when it comes particularly to all the text-heavy, jargon-heavy slides, I understand that's what people are doing. I really believe that it's a broken system. And the good news is that means, though, there's low-hanging fruit available. Right? You can be the best presenter in your field. You absolutely can, and it has nothing to do with how comfortable you are. It has everything to do with your ability and willingness to be a bit brave and to challenge the status quo. And that's what I hope you'll take from this as well.
Melissa Marshall, everybody. Thank you.
Sure. Great question. I love what you just mentioned. Yeah.
I was curious, how can I get involved with communication science like this? And I think it's important. We have 7 minutes to get to.
Okay, great. I'm going to pack my things up, so just